Danny Frank for GNAT-TV, and today we're talking with Chris Cole. Christopher is from Manchester, Vermont. He's a registered professional engineer who originally started his career working for Turner Construction in New York City. So, Chris, what was your desire and motivation to shift into this boutique, I guess, aspect of construction?
When I got transferred up to Albany in 1996 is when I really got into more of the preservation world. And when I got transferred up, I was assigned to the Rensselaer County Courthouse project in Troy, which was a great job. It had 3 or 4 different buildings, and one of them was the adaptive reuse of the county jail. And later on in early 2000, I went to RPI, had started up a preservation program. It was a weekend program that lasted 2 years, and we went every other weekend and got my degree in master's degree in building conservation. That was what really spearheaded me into the field of preservation. Working from there in Vermont, hooked up with the Preservation Trust of Vermont, where we did a lot of assessments on projects, and that has just led to a great long affiliation with them.
So as an engineer, as a contractor, as a constructor, you feel that this aspect of building is very exciting, huh?
Oh, absolutely. It's certainly different. It's not your normal, if that's the right word, design, bid, build approach that many new buildings take. It's not your traditional general contractor approach, that although some of them do go that way because of the funding involved with it. But with every one of these jobs, there's a lot of specialty contractors required for very specific items of work. And not everybody is qualified for these particular activities, and there are standards that are established by the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Preservation, which is part of the National Park Service, that all publicly funded projects, especially when you get into grants, state, federal grants, you'll come across it in Vermont with Act 250 regulations, you'll come across it historic districts, you'll come across it, where most of the work, or all the work, has to follow these guidelines. And within these guidelines there are standards for experience as well. So it really changes the playing field as to who are the people and how the projects are managed.
Well, I also guess that especially with public infrastructure, public buildings, at one point in time a decision was made to invest in those buildings and create them. And now, of course, to do right by those buildings and these communities, we need to keep investing in them.
I totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. And that's one of the costs, the hidden cost that you don't talk about is the embodied energy in a building. And exactly that. The people that built it and the bricks and mortar that's standing has value to it, and there's energy to it, and it's been there for a long time. And look at a lot of the buildings that have been preserved. The Equinox Hotel. It's great that they didn't. There was talk about knocking it down. They had a fire, and the easy thing to do would have been to knock it down. And quite often, I think it sat vacant for many, many years in its state before somebody picked it up. And quite often, buildings survive out of the lack of economic funds to fix them. And they just survive, and they survive, and they survive until somebody comes along. And just look at a lot of the downtowns right now. I think you're seeing a big movement in the last 10, 15 years where people are restoring old buildings, and it does bring value to a community, and it does bring value to a downtown. It's just knocking a building down and putting up a replacement. It just doesn't do it the same flavor as restoring a building. Obviously, there's costs and pros and cons to all that, but in general, I don't think there's any substitution.
There must be a process that leads to the upgrading or the improvements or rehabilitation of a particular property or structure. Can you describe some of that for us?
Sure. Quite often, a lot of the work that I have done has been for the public market, okay? And with that, the Preservation Trust of Vermont has been tremendous in assisting a lot of these non-for-profits that the jobs that I've worked on.
So that's an organization, the Preservation Trust of Vermont.
That is correct.
I think this booklet here.
This is great. This is their latest restoration directory, where they list a lot of the preservation specialists in the state, designers, engineers, contractors. It's a very good resource.
And you're involved with these people.
I am. Many of the jobs that I worked on that you have some reports here, conditions assessments, started out just like that. And one case study is Bennington Project Independence down the road, which we'll talk about in a little while. Where that started many, many years before you put any shovel into the ground, you start with an assessment. So what typically happens, the Preservation Trust hooks up with the owner. They have a very small amount that they put forward to fund this report. And I've done 20 of these throughout the last many years for them. Basically, these reports are a very brief overview, assessment of the building, and with recommendations on how to preserve it within the standards. Okay, so following the standard. It gives a brief description of the structure, of the condition, a brief budget of what you could expect, where to put your money. And this is just to preserve the building in its state. This is not to turn it into something different or adaptive review. It's a conditions assessment. But this gives them the basis to go for grants. So a lot of these non-for-profits use these reports, go out on various different agencies to get funding.
And also, I want you to clear up a misconception that a lot of these properties we're talking about do not necessarily come under the National Register of Historic Places, right? That's a whole different.
Well, no, that's very much part of it.
Okay.
And the misnomer is, the big misnomer with that is, a lot of people feel that if they don't, there are people that don't want their buildings to be on the National Register because they feel they're going to be told what to do. Okay, and that's not the case. The National Register of Historic Places is it's an honorary measure bestowed on building owners. Your neighbor can recommend you to be on the National Register of Historic Places. Where the teeth of this is in the project that you're planning on doing. If you're a private resident in a non-historic district and you have a historic building, you can pretty much do what you want to do. What the issue is when you get into federal funding, anything that ties you back to the government. The government ties you back to the Secretary of Interior standards. You get $1 of federal funds, you're in. You have a building in a historic district. You have a building in Vermont, Act 250 is that overall that gets you in. Because Act 250 is a government standard, they have to go through the environmental, and that's where you'll find these preservation standards. And the issue is, the way that it's written in the state laws is, it's not being on the register, it's being eligible to be on the register. So you don't even have to be on the register. If you are eligible to be on the register, you're in. You're in. This is a good example. This is the Oliver Rice building. This building used to be in Bennington. Route 7A project comes in, they're going to take it down because it was in the way of the highway. Peter Palmer salvaged the building, brought it up to Manchester, erected it, did a beautiful restoration job, put it up behind the old tavern, where it sat. It's been there for many, many, many years. It's had a couple different uses it wanted to go through. The most recent is the downtown school that just moved into that spot. We were involved with the downtown school on the conversion of this from a residential office to a school, okay, with the state. Obviously, there was a lot of issues the state had with making a school out of this building. It's not handicapping, there's several issues. Being that if it qualified as historic status, meaning that it's eligible to be on the historic, if it qualifies for historic status, it comes under many different, there are different sections of the building code, life safety code, accessibility code, that this would fall under. And under those different divisions, there are modifications and there are ways of not necessarily bringing it up to full code compliance, but you have to have that eligibility. Being that the building was moved, that's typically one of the first strikes against you for being on the National Register. So to make a long story short, we had to go to the state and get the state to agree. We were dealing with the state fire marshal in Rutland, and they wanted us to do a long list of things. And we felt that the building does qualify for preservation status. We went to the State Historic Preservation Office, got preservation status, and then went back to the state code division and had a whole different sheet to look at. They were able to open the building without any major cost impacts to the structure.
There's this opera house in the village of Manchester, this historic, old, high-profile opera house, which has just sat idle for many years. And what are the economics of undertaking a rehab project like the opera house, and at what point does the decision become where it just makes more sense to tear something down?
That's a very difficult, that's a tough question. But on the drawing board, you really have to you have to know who the client is, who the owner of the building is, and what their intent of the building is, okay? So what is the use of the building going to be? What is the expected use of the building? Adaptive reuse is a very common and very acceptable term, and getting a building occupied and used makes it more economically practical. So that would be a big component to answer that question. Without knowing all the facts, I couldn't get into the details on that. Second part of it is the community that it's in. It is in a historic district. I don't know if Act 250, the Equinox, I believe, owns that building. I'm not sure how that ties into the whole property there, but Act 250 would have something to say about that. Okay, so and with that there are incentives. When you do a downtown, historic downtown, there are tax incentives. There are incentives for restoring buildings in downtown. So there are incentives out there, and you would just have to weigh all the pluses and minuses. Obviously, you'd have to start with a conditions assessment and then work with an estimate to what would it cost to rehabilitate this building based on the intended use. That's a simple, which we do all the time, estimating function. What's the number? Okay, what's the scope? What's the number? We can come to that. Whether it's worth it or not is really the developer's call.
I want to discuss some of your case studies. I know we're looking here at the Bennington Project Independence, I believe, right?
That is correct.
So can you tell us a little bit about what took place here?
Harwood Hill Farmstead, the old barn, late 1700s, the house, 1700s, 1800s additions, a bunch of other outbuildings. This was a study we did a conditions assessment on, a feasibility study on it. They went out, raised a lot of money, both private and public funds, being on historic Route 7A. V-Trans was involved with it. V-Trans has a whole historic preservation division within their own organ. So you have the V-Trans Preservation Group, the State Historic Preservation Group, the Preservation Trust of Vermont Group. Great use of public funds.
This is the re-erection of Ying Yu Tang, right?
Yeah,
which is another, sounds very interesting, complex preservation, right?
That it is. This is a Chinese house that was dismantled, brought to the States, preserved piece by piece, stone by stone, in a warehouse in Boston, then re-erected at the Peabody Essex Museum, basically as an exhibit. But it's outside in the elements. We had to use materials that would weather the New England. We had to bring it up to code. We had a group of Chinese timber framers, masons, artisans that were brought over. Timber framer out of Vermont, a fellow named Jan Lewandowski, very well-known timber framer. Great working with them. And then the Boston Unions.
The Rockingham Meeting Home, tell me the Rockingham Meeting House, what's that all about?
Rockingham Meeting House is one of the two National Historic Landmarks in Vermont. The other one is the Calvin Coolidge Estate grounds in Plymouth. National Historic Landmark is the highest status you can achieve in the preservation standing. Very, very special building. It's a late 1700s, I'm not going to say untouched, but very, very little work has been done to this over the years. There's no heat, it has electricity, but there's no heat in the building, not insulated. It's very much intact the way it was when it was built. It's a very famous building, beautiful building. This is the Reedsboro, the Bullock Building in Reedsboro. It's a mid-18th century Victorian period mansard roof building. It was the Masonic Hall for many years. It's the same thing, second floor, big ballroom, open space. In total disarray. The roof had been leaks all over the place, very bad condition, and the local group acquired it with some help from the Preservation Trust, Senator Leahy's office, money was invested. First we had done an estimate on this building to do a full rehab, fit out, code upgrade, elevator. You were in the $2.5 million to bring this building up to its full potential. They had $100,000 and a roof that leaked, and a building that. What do you do? What they did was we couldn't even fix the roof properly. We had to do a Band-Aid. We did a Band-Aid fix on the roof. We fixed the structural hole. We did some basic renovations in the basement, put a handicap bathroom in on the first floor, a handicap ramp, and they opened it for $100,000. They opened the front door.
What are some of Vermont's oldest, about the older homes in Vermont where they could be considered historical and worth preserving? What do you have to say to those property owners and homeowners? What should they do? Should they think about preserving them?
It all starts with the exterior, and it all starts with the roof. Keep a good roof in the building, keep the water out, which most homeowners do. But even with an outbuilding, a barn or something, keep the water out. Just keep it standing. There's always hope for the building to be preserved. But without question, now in the residential market, there is a residential code and there is a residential energy code. A lot of people know or don't know that. It's not regulated as much as the public work, but it's still there. And I would say to a lot of the reasons people want to renovate a home, period, is for energy, handicap accessibility, technology, those things. You can certainly do that to a historic building and still maintain the character of the building. One of the most significant pieces to a historic building are the featured elements, the doors, the windows. First thing people challenge are the doors and the windows because of energy. You can make an original window and a door very energy efficient. And that is one of the most character defining elements of the home. So I urge people not to go out and do a window replacement, not to do a door replacement, not to do a trim replacement. Don't rip everything off the building. The people have done it, and as long as, if you're very careful and you're very crafty, you can put it back together. But most of the preservation work on a home is from the inside, is done on the inside. And you can get to a very energy efficient building without destroying a lot of the historic fabric.